Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
As we finish off our examination into who wrote the gospel books, let's summarize what we've seen so far. First, the gospel books were written by Matthew the Apostle, Mark writing the testimony of the Apostle Peter, Luke the Gentile companion and fellow worker of Paul, and John the Apostle and closest friend of Jesus. These authorships were not challenged for 1,500 years until the era of the Enlightenment, with its ethos to drive God out of society. This required discrediting Christianity, which in turn required discrediting the gospel books. They couldn't have them to be eyewitness testimony, so arbitrarily they were proclaimed to have been anonymous. No evidence was offered for this claim, of course, but scholarly prestige caused the views to be widely accepted. The claims were actually motivated by the desires we've seen, stoked by that ethos of the Enlightenment to drive out God. Scholars proclaim that the gospel books were originally anonymous, and the first one was written 100 years after Jesus' crucifixion. Manuscript discoveries later forced them to admit that the books were all written in the first century, but they still date them no earlier than AD 66, when the destruction of the temple that took place in AD 70 by the Romans could reasonably have been expected to happen. Dating them any earlier would mean Jesus accurately prophesied the destruction of the temple in Matthew 24, 1-2, and Mark 13, 1-2, and that they are not willing to accept. So their claims are based on metaphysical bias, not on evidence. In fact, when we got to the evidence and we began looking at it, we saw that it overwhelmingly supports the authorship of the books by Matthew, by Mark, by Luke, and by John. We saw that every manuscript that has the title as the first page in it has those authors listed. There is not one manuscript of a gospel book with the first page floating around with no title. Besides the titles, we have quite a number of early Christian writers who were in a position to know, testifying that the Apostle Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark, the companion of Peter, wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, and John the Apostle wrote John. Even the quality of the Greek writing in the individual books, as we've seen, are consistent with these authorships. On the other hand, liberal scholars we saw offer no countervailing evidence to support their contention that the books were originally anonymous. Now let's bring this home.
But in other words, there's a mountain of evidence that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the gospel books, and that this scholarly consensus that the books were originally anonymous is then essentially based on nothing.
Well, I'd say, yeah. I would say exactly. It's not based on anything. Nothing. Every once in a while, they throw out claims like this about the Greek or about anonymous quotations. So they every once in a while they will put something forth that prima facie might look like evidence, but even a little bit of examination shows that they aren't. They're based on nothing, and every once in a while you will find a liberal scholar who will admit that. Dr. Gerhard Ludemann, for example, he is one of the most prolific and respected liberal scholars of this day. He's written so many books, What Jesus Didn't Say, and all kinds of books attacking the historicity of the gospel books and attacking the credibility of Christianity. It's interesting in his book, What Jesus Didn't Say, you read at the beginning, and he writes this, quote, 3 presuppositions underlying my work are the following. First, the authors of the 4 Gospels of the New Testament are not known. Second, the authors were not eyewitnesses. So these are these presuppositions. They're not known. Second, the authors were not eyewitnesses. Any comment on that, Johnny?
Just seems to be a bunch of assertions rather than anything substantial.
Yeah, they are. And it's interesting also, it says the authors are not known, they're not eyewitnesses. Well, if you don't know who they were, How could you know whether they were eyewitnesses or not? So
It's true.
liberals will trip themselves up very quickly and very often. But what I do want to point out here, he says 3 presuppositions underlying my work. Okay? Number 1, the authors are not known. It's anonymous. Okay? Second, the authors are not eyewitnesses. They're presuppositions. Well, what is a presupposition? Okay? What is a presupposition? If you look at the Cambridge Dictionary, for example, this is what comes up as the definition for presupposition. Something that you believe is true without having any proof. Right? Something that you believe is true without having any proof. And Dr. Gerd Ludemann is basically admitting it's by presupposition that the Gospels are anonymous. So I believe they're anonymous without having any proof. Second presupposition, they were not eyewitnesses. Presupposition. So he believes they're not eyewitnesses but has no proof. And so every once in a while, the liberal scholars will admit that they're believing these without proof. Now, it's actually worse than that. It's one thing to believe something without proof. It's quite another thing to believe something against the proof. We have adduced, even in this program, several strong lines of evidence on this issue. Okay? Number 1, the manuscripts themselves have the titles. And number 2, we have external testimony from many people in a position to know who are telling us Matthew, Mark, Luke, John wrote these books. So from the position of liberal scholarship, it's not just that you have to assume they're anonymous and assume that the authors were not eyewitnesses. You have to actually discard the actual evidence. You have to ignore this external testimony. You have to ignore the titles. You could say, well, the titles were added later. I can't give you a manuscript without a title, but I still believe that. Well, they can do that, but they're going against the evidence, and particularly with the external testimony. They are having to ignore what was recorded for us by people in a position to know. They're saying, well, Papias says that, but Papias doesn't know what he's talking about. Papias is wrong. So Papias, who's writing in the time of eyewitnesses, he doesn't know, but the liberal scholar writing 18 or 1900 years later does know. There's a little certain hubris there, I would think. You cannot ignore the proof just because you don't like it.
Wow. I mean, not only are they basing, their academic field on presuppositions, but they're basing their eternal destiny on them. But it's even worse than that. I don't know if you would call this willful ignorance or just outright rejection, but that's terrible. And is this, I guess, the sort of attitude that is common amongst liberal biblical scholarship?
Unfortunately, it is. It is ubiquitous, I would say. You will find assertion after assertion, claim after claim, and very, very rarely do you see evidence offered for it. And where evidence is offered, it's usually like the sort of evidence we've seen here, where it really, the supposed evidence does not support the claim at all. It's very easily shown to be not evidence at all. And this is why you can never be satisfied simply looking up a Wikipedia article or picking up a book here and say, okay, the scholars say this, the scholarly consensus is that. You need to go by the actual evidence. Let me point out one more thing that's significant about biblical scholarship, okay? And that is the law of universal gravitation.
Okay, what does that have to do with biblical scholarship?
The law of universal gravitation, the force of attraction between two masses is equal to some constant g multiplied by the two masses and divided by the square of the distance between them. Discovered by Isaac Newton in the 17th century, though he couldn't figure out the constant, the value of g. That was left to Henry Cavendish, who discovered it in 1798 through an absolutely brilliant experiment. So now we have the law of universal gravitation. Force of attraction between any two masses is equal to 6.67 times 10 to the minus 11 Newton meter squared per kilogram squared times m1 times m2 over r squared. And why is this, what does this have to do with biblical scholarship? Here's what it has to do. You have the experts in physics, PhDs, experts in sciences, experts in astronomy. It doesn't matter if they're liberal or conservative. It doesn't matter if they're Christian or Muslim or Buddhist or secular or Jewish. They will all agree on that. Nobody will question it. It's a fact. Doesn't matter what their biases are, what their political affiliations, they will all agree. F is equal to gm1 m2 over r squared. But when it comes to biblical scholarship, and other so-called soft sciences. You can have a guy with a PhD in biblical studies who will tell you Jesus rose from the dead, and you'll have another guy with a PhD in biblical studies from an equally qualified university saying, nope, Jesus died and his body was thrown to the dogs. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you that biblical scholarship is not like hard sciences. We have a scholarly consensus. You really will have two consensuses at least. Okay? And one will come from liberal scholarship, which assumes supernatural is impossible, and therefore will base their views of the gospel books and the Bible in general on this presupposition. They will be required to and will ignore the actual evidence. But anytime you have a field where equally qualified people can say the exact opposite things with a straight face, you know there's a problem, and you know you cannot simply accept a supposed scholarly consensus. You need to look at the evidence. That's what we do. That was the point I made in my debate with Shabir Ali last year. On my entire opening statement was the need to look at evidence, because Shabir would simply be bringing forth a scholarly consensus of liberal scholars to try to undermine the New Testament. And I couldn't simply say, well, but conservative evangelical scholars will say this. No, we have to look at the evidence. Our view has to be based on the evidence. And unfortunately, in all branches, not just liberal scholarship, but increasingly in evangelical scholarship too, we are coming up with consensuses that simply do not go where the evidence leads. So that's what you need to do. Okay? In this case, as we've seen, the evidence proves that the gospel books were indeed written by Matthew, the apostle, Mark, the companion of Peter, Luke, the Gentile physician, and John, the apostle, closest companion of Jesus. That's what the evidence shows. And that enhances their credibility as historical documents tremendously. And so to answer our open question, does it matter? Indeed, it does. And they come through, in terms of authorship, they come through smelling like roses. The same will apply when we look at questions like when they were written, the dates of the gospel books, and other issues as well. And so that's I'm hoping that this is useful for you and that you see the importance of it. There are a lot of forces out there that want to discredit gospel books. It's been on for a long time. It's going on now. But rest assured, the evidence supports the fact that they are indeed reliable and we can trust them.
Nice. I think this is why I'm very thankful to have an engineer as a pastor, a man of science who knows exactly how to examine the evidence and go to the conclusion where the evidence leads us. And I think hopefully in the future, we will have more segments that will address this issue, because I think as far as the actual evidence go, I think these days, very often we tend to trust in narratives or consensus rather than being told what the evidence is. So, and in terms of coming to faith in Jesus Christ, in terms of trusting the Bible, this is of crucial importance, because this is where our eternal destiny lies. So thank you very much for going through this topic on authorship. And thank you very much for listening to our program today. This is Johnny signing off with our pastor, John Torres, and we look forward to share with you in our future segments. Have a good day.
Thank you, Johnny.
Thank you, sir.
If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torres. We would love to hear from you. Please feel free to share any questions or comments you may have. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, MeWe, and YouTube. Simply search Truth in My Days as one word. Again, Truth in My Days as one word, no spaces in between. And you can connect with us. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.